Okay, this is the first instructor-produced YouTube video for Module 2, Hinduism. Of course, at this point, we're done with the introduction to religions, and we'll be moving through particular religions one by one, beginning with Hinduism, perhaps the oldest of the religions that we'll be discussing. And this is Module 2, Part 1, Introduction to Hinduism. Just a few brief general comments before we get moving here. As I mentioned, Hinduism is perhaps the oldest of the great world religions. It can be traced back, about 4,000 years. And when we do our brief review of history, you'll see why that's the case. The scriptures of Hinduism are voluminous. If you were to actually count them by books, there are over 100 books. So it's not as if a person can hand you the Hindu Bible, so to speak. There are literally tens and tens of books, including in the corpus of scriptures. And a bit more about that later. Hinduism is a monistic religion. You may recall the term monism that we discussed earlier, meaning that there is one recognized high God, Brahman, B-R-A-H-M-A-N, and this one particular high God is represented in many, many different ways. So basically one God with many faces. So one high God with many different manifestations in the form of all the gods and goddesses that we typically associate with Hinduism. So while Hinduism may appear to be polytheistic, it is actually monistic, more properly monistic. And when people view the statues of Krishna, Vishnu, and Hanuman, and Kali, etc., they are actually looking through that symbolic representation to Brahman. These are just different ways of representing Brahman. So, for example, when you think of the Brahman as a creator God, then that form of Brahman is Brahma, without the N, B-R-A-H-M-A. Brahman as the creator God, Brahma. When you think of the Brahman as the nurturer, then that form of Brahman is Vishnu. If a worshipper prefers to view Brahman as a female divinity, then there are many female representations of Brahman as well. In fact, there's even a special sect of Hindus that devote themselves to the female manifestation or manifestations of Brahman. And so a bit more about that a little bit later. Another general point about Hinduism is that it tends to become more and more complex and diverse through time. What you find is, with Hinduism, very ancient beliefs on top of which have been grafted more modern and newer ideas. And so the picture you get is one of a religion that sort of just gradually opens its arms through time and becomes more variegated, more complex through time. It's not restrictive in the way that one might categorize Catholicism, for example. Historically, Catholicism has tended to sort of circle the wagons, so to speak, to protect its theological turf. Catholicism has not been inclined to accommodate opposing ideas and alternate ideas. But Hinduism has. And that's one of the things that makes it such a complex, rich, and fascinating religion. And then finally, the last general comment has to do with the term Hindu. Best we can tell, it started as an ancient Persian term, Sindhu, S-I-N-D-H-U, Sindhu, that was used for what's today called the Indus River. Later, Arabic-speaking peoples used the term Al-Hind, A-L, which is the, and then H-I-N-D, for the land beyond the Indus River. And then eventually, the people beyond the Indus River began to be called Hindus. So what we're dealing with here is an exonym, E-X-O-N-Y-M, a term that originated outside the area in which it's used today. Interestingly enough, the term Hindu cannot be found in the ancient Vedic scriptures of Hinduism. It's not a Sanskrit term at all. In fact, it's not a term of any native Indian language. So it very much is a term that comes from the outside. Now, of course, through time, Indians have grown to accept Hinduism as the term for their religion, but actually a more accurate indigenous term for the religion Hinduism is Sanatana Dharma, S-A-N-A-T-A-N-A, Dharma, D-H-A-R-M-A, which means something like eternal teachings or eternal truth. So really, if the Indians themselves had their say, they would probably use the term Sanatana Dharma for their religion. Just a few historical comments on Hinduism. It begins about 4,000 years ago when people called the Aryans, A-R-Y-A-N-S, began to sort of migrate into India. It wasn't an invasion or anything like that, but just a sort of a natural movement of people into India from the north and northwest, basically Central Asia. And from this very early time period, we get classical, so-called classical Hinduism, a time period in which the Vedas were produced. That's the oldest written scriptures of Hinduism, the Vedas. And this is the time of rituals and priests and temples and the reading of scriptures and the making of sacrifices, etc. And it's referred to as classical Hinduism. And we date that from around 2000 BCE. The next major event in the history of Hinduism occurred around 500 BCE. And there are a few things going on at that time. The advent of Buddhism and Jainism were both occurring at that time, and both were challenges to Hindu traditions. But more importantly, the Upanishads, U-P-A-N-I-S-H-A-D-S, the Upanishads, were written around 500 BCE, and that marked a major change in Hindu theology, Hindu ideology, as the Upanishads introduce a lot of new ideas, including the idea of the Atman, also the Atman being the, well, you could roughly call it the Hindu soul, but really it's a piece of Brahman that is possessed by all beings. Atman. The idea of samsara, basically the cycle of life and death. Tattvam Asi, T-A-T-T-V-A-M-A-S-I. It can be translated as roughly that thou art. And basically your Atman is the Brahman. So everyone has a piece of the divinity in them. Reincarnation, karma, the importance of asceticism. Asceticism referring to going without material things, renunciation, fasting, etc. And also meditation. So all of these things were introduced by the Upanishads, which marked a a major change in Hinduism, and this would give us the path of knowledge. So that first segment of Hindu history, the Vedic period, or the classical period, we could refer to as the path of duties, that began around 2000 BCE. And then the path of knowledge, with the introduction of the Upanishads, begins about 500 BCE. And then finally, the last major historical event occurred when the so-called devotional period began around 400 CE. And that gives us the path of devotion. And at this point in time, people began to sing hymns and praises to the various Hindu gods in their native tongues. Of course, there are hundreds of native tongues in India. And that gives us the path of devotion. So just to sum up, from 2000 BCE, we have the path of duties associated with classical Vedic Hinduism. Around 500 BCE, the path of knowledge begins with the introduction of the Upanishads. And then finally, the path of devotion is introduced around 400 CE. Now, you will note that I didn't actually mention an end time for any of these periods. And that's because there is no stopping point or end time for these periods. They're all continuing today, which tells you something about Hinduism and what it means to be a Hindu. There are a variety of ways that one can be a Hindu, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. As far as the geographical setting, we addressed that a bit in the first module. But let me just state here that today there are almost 1 billion Hindus in the world. The three most populous Hindu nations are India, of course, Bangladesh, and Nepal. In India there are almost 900 million Hindus, and in both Bangladesh and Nepal there are over 10 million Hindus. And of course there are millions of Hindus in areas surrounding India. In case you're wondering, there are about 1.5 million Hindus in the United States today. And then finally, just a note about the scriptures. I realize you do have lots of materials in front of you. I just want to give you a brief overview. The scriptures of Hinduism are of two basic types. The primary or revealed scriptures are called the Shruti, S-H-R-U-T-I. And it is thought that these are the original revelations that were heard by ancient seers, S-E-E-R-S, ancient holy men, in other words, and they're thought to be revealed scriptures, much as Muslims consider the Quran to be revealed and Christians consider the Bible to be revealed. So these are the primary scriptures of Hinduism. They include, and by the way, these are the oldest scriptures of Hinduism, and they're written between 1500 and 500 BCE. The oldest of the Hindu scriptures are the Vedas, of which there are 4, and the oldest of the Vedas is called the Rig Veda. It's thought that it was written about 1500 BCE, which makes it one of the oldest existing religious scriptures, written religious scriptures that we have. Furthermore, it's thought that this lore was passed on for thousands of years before it was actually written down. So I guess technically speaking, it's much older than 3,500 years old. But nevertheless, that was when it was first written down, so we'll use that as the origin point for the oldest Hindu scriptures. Of course, the Shruti also include the Upanishads, which were written about 500 BCE, and which sort of closes the time period of the revealed scriptures. And I've talked about the Upanishads already. And the introduction, of course, the Upanishads really marked a major change a major shift in Hinduism. So that's that first form or type of Hindu scriptures. There are also another form of Hindu scriptures called the Smriti, S-M-R-I-T-I. The Smriti are basically commentaries on the Shruti, and also laws and epic tales and so forth. Probably the most important is the Mahabharata, M-A-H-A-B-H-A-R-A-T-A, the Mahabharata, which is the great story of the Bharata family, or the Bharata dynasty, a ruling dynasty in India. And one of the important parts of the tale is included in what's called the Bhagavad Gita, which is part of the Mahabharata. Bhagavad Gita, B-H-A-V-A-V-A-D, and then G-I-T-A, probably the most famous of the Hindu scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita details the story of Arjuna, which is a soldier who's about to fight in one of these great battles that's discussed in the Mahabharata, and Krishna, which is a manifestation of the Hindu god Vishnu, who has come to earth to give us guidance through his conversations with Arjuna. Arjuna basically is hesitant to fight. He doesn't want to shed blood. He doesn't want to kill individuals. Krishna basically tells him that, first of all, no one is killing anyone because we all live on. There's a cycle of life and death that will continue, and no human has the power to vanquish a human soul. So people will continue to live on. And basically Krishna encourages Arjuna to do his duty. He was born a warrior. He was trained to be a warrior. And so he is honor-bound and duty-bound to follow his destiny. Anyway, so that's the story of the Bhagavad Gita. And then there are other works as well. Probably the most famous epic is the Ramayana epic, R-A-M-A-Y-A-N-A, the Ramayana epic. And this details the story of Rama and his wife Sita. It's a pretty fascinating drama. Rama is exiled and Sita is captured by this demon and imprisoned on an island. And Rama enlists the help of Hanuman, the so-called monkey god, to help him rescue his wife. Anyway, it's an incredible tale, the Ramayana epic, and it's often reproduced in plays and movies and videos in India, much as we might tell the Easter story, for example, or the Ten Commandments. And so there you go. So the Hindu scriptures are comprised primarily of the Shruti scriptures, written from around 1500 to 500 BCE, the primary revealed scriptures, and then also the Smriti, sort of commentaries on the revealed scriptures, written from about 500 BCE to 1000 CE, and they also include the epics and also various laws. Okay, so that does it for Module 2, Part 1, and in the next module we're going to continue our discussion of Hinduism and pick it up with a discussion of Brahman.